The Broadway musical was one of the great art forms created in the 20th century, and the impact that the partnership of Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II had on it, on its golden age, was huge. Indeed, to understand how the golden age came about, it is necessary to look in depth at what is arguably the most important musical ever written, Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma. For that show marked the beautiful morning of what would become the golden age of the Broadway musical. Its total integration of words, music, dance, story, and characters became the template for the many masterpieces of musical theater that quickly followed. Now, only in retrospect does it seem surprising that there were empty seats in the St. James Theater the night that Oklahoma opened. After all, no member of the cast could have remotely been called a star. The Theater Guild, which produced it, was at the end of its financial rope after a disastrous series of failures. Agnes DeMille, the choreographer, well known and respected in the small world of serious dance, had not yet had a Broadway success. Ruben Mamoulian, principally a film director, had done only one prior Broadway musical, Porgy and Bess, an artistic success, but a financial failure. Richard Rodgers, for the first time in his life, was writing songs with somebody other than Lawrence Hart, and no one, including himself, knew how he would do. Oscar Hammerstein II, meanwhile, had had 6 Broadway flops in a row. The smart money certainly wasn't expecting much. The producer, Mike Todd, who walked out after the first act during the show's New Haven tryout, had returned to New York to wisecrack, no legs, no jokes, no chance. But Mike Todd was wrong. Instead, Samuel Johnson had proved to be right, and the prospect of being hanged, at least professionally, had concentrated minds wonderfully. The next day, the reviews were nearly unanimous raves, and Mike Todd was hastily denying that he had ever badmouthed the show. The police had to be summoned to cope with a near riot at the box office. Oklahoma was awarded a special Pulitzer Prize. By the time it closed, half a decade later, Oklahoma had run more than 3 times as long as any book musical in history up to that point. Its investors had earned $33 in return for each $1 that they had risked. The road company would tour the country for over 10 years, and Oklahoma has been performed all over the world in dozens of different languages ever since. And even today, 80 years after it opened, it enjoys hundreds of new productions every year, from Broadway and the West End to high schools. But Oklahoma was more than just a smash hit. Its influence on the future of the art form was titanic. For to put it simply, no musical written after Oklahoma was unaffected by it, from comedies such as Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and The Music Man to tragedies such as West Side Story. The Broadway musical has a long history dating back to the mid-19th century. Many theatrical historians regard something called The Black Crook, which opened in 1866, as the first one. The ancestors of the form include the extravaganza, a type of show that specialized in special effects and elaborate staging and costumes. Vaudeville, with its comic routines and dance numbers, also contributed substantially. European operetta contributed plots that were more substantial than those of musical comedies, although they were often set in exotic locales and featured stories involving mismatched lovers, such as milkmaids and princes. The comic operettas of Gilbert and Sullivan, wildly popular in the United States as well as Britain, also played an important part in the history of the Broadway musical. Many of the song forms typical of modern musicals, such as the contest song, Anything You Can Do, I Can Do Better from Annie Get Your Gun is a famous contest song, were invented by Gilbert and Sullivan. The wordplay and elaborate rhyme, so characteristic of Broadway lyrics, also descends from the comic genius of W.S. Gilbert. The plots of musicals of the early 20th century were either slight or improbable, the characters pasteboard, and the jokes and songs often had little, if anything, to do with either. Stars often had written into their contracts the right to do their particular shtick, such as playing the ukulele at a particular time of the night, and that would just have to be shoehorned into the plot one way or another by the authors. To give you an example of how fluid musical theater was in the early days, consider Cole Porter's Anything Goes, which opened in 1934. Set on an ocean liner, the original plot involved a shipwreck. But a few weeks into rehearsals, the liner Morro Castle burned off New Jersey, causing the death of 138 people. It was thought bad taste to have a comedy about a shipwreck so soon after that. So with the songs already in rehearsal, a substantially new plot was devised and put into effect. Doing something like that after Oklahoma would have been impossible. But musical comedies, while insubstantial, could also be very inventive, often on the cutting edge of popular music. Moreover, musical comedy lyrics, at least for the major songs, were carefully written, poetically sophisticated, and often extremely witty. As with Gilbert and Sullivan, and unlike European musical theater or grand opera, the words were just as important as the music was. Now, Richard Rodgers was born in 1902 into a prosperous family. His father was a doctor, as later would be his older brother Mortimer. Although no relative had ever been a professional musician, there was a strong family love of music. His mother played the piano well, and group singing of the latest hit songs was a common evening's entertainment in the household. Rodgers, at a very early age, showed extraordinary musical aptitude, playing the piano easily by ear. Before long, he was displaying that rarest of all musical talents, a gift for writing melodies that people never get tired of hearing. He soon decided on a career in the theater, and his family, most unusually, encouraged him in this, even backing his decision to transfer from Columbia University to the Institute of Musical Art, now known as the Juilliard School. Because of his Juilliard training, Rodgers was among the most musically well-educated of Broadway composers of his time. Irving Berlin, by way of contrast, could not even read music and could only play the piano in the key of F sharp. He had a special piano with a lever that allowed him to play in other keys. At Columbia, Rodgers had met a budding lyricist named Lorenz Hart and soon started writing songs with him. For the next 20 years, Rodgers and Hart were to be that great exception in the artistically promiscuous world of musical theater, an exclusive songwriting team. Indeed, there was only one earlier, Gilbert and Sullivan, and even today, 80 years after Hart's death, there have been only two others, Rodgers and Hammerstein and Kander and Ebb. From the beginning in 1925 with the Garrick Gaieties, which featured the song Manhattan, when Rodgers was not quite 23 and Hart was 30, the pair knew almost nothing but success, except for a brief stint in Hollywood after the talkies came in. Already considered Broadway royalty in New York, Rodgers and Hart were treated like servants by the studio executives. But Hart would get his revenge in a line from Pal Joey when he wrote, "His thoughts are seldom consecutive. He just can't write. I know a movie executive who's twice as bright." In the late 30s and early 40s, Rodgers and Hart turned out one big hit show after another. On Your Toes, Babes in Arms, Pal Joey, and By Jupiter among them. Many of the Rodgers and Hart shows were highly innovative, pushing the musical comedy form in new directions. In Pal Joey, for instance, the title character was a thoroughgoing, two-timing no-goodnik. On Your Toes introduced classical ballet to Broadway with Slaughter on 10th Avenue, choreographed by George Balanchine. Rodgers married in 1930 and fathered two daughters. With his success, he had the world on a string. But Hart, as he moved into middle age, was an increasingly tormented man. Although he was enormously gifted with language, that did not compensate for the fact that he was only about 5 feet tall, with the big head and short limbs of the dwarf that he very nearly was. Further, he was a homosexual in a time when homosexuality was considered at best a grave personal misfortune, at worst a matter of moral turpitude. Hart spent his life deep in the closet, and this in turn engendered in him a sadness at the core of his being that slowly congealed into a profound self-loathing. He would have fully subscribed to what his contemporary and fellow poet Samuel Hoffenstein meant when he wrote, "Everywhere I go too, and spoil everything." Hart turned more and more to alcohol. He took to disappearing for days at a time or showing up in no condition to work. Rodgers, a fastidious, careful, punctual man, bore Hart's deteriorating behavior with great patience, not usually a virtue for which Rodgers was noted. Together, they created extraordinary songs that often achieved their power and longevity from the very tension between the opposite natures of the two creators. Just consider one of their most famous, Falling in Love with Love, from The Boys from Syracuse, 1938. The music is one of Rodgers' sunniest, most lilting waltzes, but it is set in a minor key to match Hart's lyric, which speaks for itself. Falling in love with love is falling for make-believe. Falling in love with love is playing the fool. Caring too much is such a juvenile fancy. Learning to trust is just for children in school. I fell in love with love one night when the moon was full. I was unwise with eyes unable to see. I fell in love with love everlasting, but love fell out with me. Even before By Jupiter opened in 1942 and became the biggest hit Rodgers and Hart ever wrote, Rodgers realized that his partner's ability to write another show was problematic, at best. He also knew that he himself needed to keep on working, even if his partner could not. Rodgers didn't know where to turn, so he turned, as so many in the New York theater did when they needed advice, to Oscar Hammerstein II. Unlike Rodgers, Hammerstein was born to the theater as few Broadway giants were. His grandfather and namesake was probably the most famous person in American show business in the 2 decades surrounding the turn of the 20th century. Oscar I built 11 theaters over the course of his life in New York, Philadelphia, and London. It was he who established Times Square as the center of New York's theater district. His passion for grand opera would cause a revolution in how opera was produced. His Victoria Theater of Varieties on Times Square, which opened in 1904, was an enormously successful vaudeville house. More, Oscar I had a genius for publicity, getting his face and his name in the papers over and over again. When a critic panned one of his shows, Oscar wrote him a letter, which, of course, he passed on to a gossip columnist for publication. The letter read, "Dear sir, I am seated in the smallest room in my house. Your review is before me. Shortly, it'll be behind me." Oscar I's son, William, the father of Oscar II, worked as a Victoria's manager, and while far more down-to-earth than his father, William was equally creative as a theatrical manager. It was Willie Hammerstein who is credited with having invented that perennial favorite of lowbrow comedy, the pie-in-the-face routine. And it was Willie who suggested to Will Rodgers that he should tell jokes while doing his tricks with his lariat. Under the circumstances, young Oscar, who was born in 1895, could hardly have escaped a careful education in the theater, from La Boheme to blackface. But while Willie did not want his children to take up show business as a career, so Oscar II went to Columbia University and then entered Columbia Law School. But the law bored him, and he dropped out. His father now dead, he pestered his uncle Arthur Hammerstein, a well-known Broadway producer, for a job, and was soon working as a stage manager and writing plays and songs, usually in collaboration with others. He married early and unsuccessfully, but his second marriage to Dorothy Blanchard, whom he met quite literally across a crowded room, was famously happy. He soon had his first Broadway hit, the musical comedy Wildflower, in 1923. It had music by Vincent Youmans and a book and lyrics written jointly by Hammerstein and Otto Harbach. Although Wildflower was a big hit for the time, in fact, it ran longer than any show by Rodgers and Hart, but there was little to distinguish it from all the other musical comedies that opened and closed on Broadway with great regularity at the time. Now, while Oscar Hammerstein is today remembered as one of Broadway's greatest lyricists, it is important to remember that unlike other great lyricists, lyric writers such as E.Y. Harburg, Irving Berlin, and Frank Loesser, Hammerstein was always, first and foremost, a playwright. And as a playwright, from early on, Hammerstein sought to expand the boundaries of the American musical form. He wanted to bring it closer to operetta, which usually featured more substantial plots and characters. With his next big hit in 1924, Rose Marie, he began to do so. Then in 1927, he and composer Jerome Kern wrote Showboat.